Welcome to Inside Edition True Crime. I'm Stephanie Officer. We start off with Sal Bono, who presents a New York gritty story on the final hours of John Lennon's life. We spoke to officers who arrested the former Beatles killer, as well as the surgeon who tried to save Lennon's life.
John Lennon can't be dead.
4 cops pulled John Lennon out and put him into the back of a police car, and his mouth, he was bleeding from his mouth, and it was a terrible sight.
On the morning of December 8, 1980, John Lennon did a photo shoot for Rolling Stone magazine with his wife, Yoko Ono. Later that afternoon, they departed their building where they were greeted by a fan who wanted their autograph. Lennon signed the copy of his most recent album, Double Fantasy. Then, John Lennon and his wife came here to the record plant to record Yoko Ono's single, Walking on Thin Ice. They spent most of the day and evening here. Just after 10 p.m., they got into a car and returned home. It would be the final time John Lennon would ever step foot inside a record studio.
They stepped out of the limousine and they went inside the gate there, and then all of a sudden they heard 5, 6 shots, and that was it.
When they returned back home later that night, the same fan that asked John Lennon for an autograph pulled out a gun and shot him in cold blood in the vestibule of his building.
Mr. Chapman came up behind him and called to him, Mr. Lennon, as he arrived at that doorway. And then in a combat stance, he emptied the Charter Arms .38 caliber gun that he had with him and shot John Lennon.
Police responded to the scene right away, and when they saw the amount of blood coming from Lennon's body, they knew they could not wait for an ambulance. They took him and put him in the back of a cop car and went directly to the hospital. They also arrested the shooter, Mark David Chapman, on the scene.
Well, it was about 10:30 in the evening, and we were parked, my partner and I were parked at the corner of 72nd Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and we heard a call come over the air of possible shots fired near the Dakota. We saw a few people standing around, everybody kind of frozen. My partner got out, he ran to one side, and I came around from the other side, and some fellow was coming to me at the same time, and he said to me, "Officer, be careful, somebody's shooting a gun in there. They're firing off shots." And that's when I realized that we had the real thing happening. We didn't see Lennon at that time. And I said to Jose, the doorman who I knew, I said, "Jose, what's going on here?" And he pointed in the direction of this fellow with the overcoat on. And he said, "He just shot Lennon." So I said to my partner, Steve, I said, "Steve, stay with this guy. Put him up against the wall." I went inside and I saw Lennon lying face down on the rug. And he was bleeding profusely. I hollered out to Steve, "Steve, we got a real shooting here. Better cuff that guy." He actually was fairly polite. I turned to him and I said, "You know, you just threw your whole damn life away." Chapman started talking about a little person inside of him and a big person inside of him. The big person has been winning the battle up to now, but tonight the little person won the battle.
John Lennon was brought to Roosevelt Hospital, which is Mount Sinai Hospital today. Hospital staff at the time were notified that they had a gunshot victim that needed immediate attention. According to doctors, John Lennon was shot 4 times in the chest, with 3 of the bullets exiting his back.
The first thing I remember that was a little out of the ordinary is they paged me overhead to the ER, which they usually don't do. They would call your beeper, you'd respond, answer the beeper, they give you the name or message, whatever. The other thing that was unusual, he did not show up by ambulance. He showed up by police car. He was in the back of a cop car. He gets put on the stretcher, wheeled down the hall. He's wearing his brown leather jacket with a little fur collar. He had blue jeans on, track shoes, and a red t-shirt with Oriental print on it. Opened his chest and started giving internal cardiac massage. The heart itself was intact, and the vessels above the heart were what were injured, and we worked on them. We didn't know who he was, we just worked on him. And you get into a rhythm. You start pumping the heart, people are doing their thing, and then someone starts going through these belongings. And it's at that point someone says, his driver's license, and I remember seeing a gold American Express card that said John Lennon. And up before that, someone said, "Hey, that looks like John Lennon," and I said, "No, that's not John Lennon." You know, it's like doubting Thomas. It couldn't possibly be John Lennon. And then they brought out his stuff, his ID. It is John Lennon, and that's when I had my OMG moment.
After 30 minutes of trying to save his life, doctors pronounced John Lennon dead.
By that time, the ER director, Dr. Lynn, had been called. Once they found out who it was,
John Lennon was brought to the emergency room at the Roosevelt site, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, this evening, shortly before 11 p.m.
I mean, it affected me. Not the fact that I held his heart in my hands or operated, but the fact that he died, I think, affected me more than anything else. For the next 3 days, I couldn't listen to the radio, watch TV, read a newspaper. It was all John Lennon and just reminding me of the few nights before. And there's a lot of hindsight, second guessing. What if he wasn't so severely injured? Was there anything he could have done more? I think everything was done correctly. He was, as I said, gravely injured. But it's still, you still feel somewhat responsible. It still gnaws at you. You know where you're in certain moments in your life, and I obviously I have not forgotten this one.
Yoko Ono, who was inside the hospital, was given the sad news by doctors that her husband had passed away. She was then placed in the back of a cop car and given a police escort where she returned home to the Dakota. But at that point, word had gotten out that John Lennon had passed away, and the building was mobbed with fans from all over. In 1985, Yoko Ono and then New York City Mayor Ed Koch dedicated part of Central Park to John Lennon's memory. Ono, who still lives in the Dakota, overlooks the area known as Strawberry Fields, where she can see fans sing her husband's songs, lay flowers, and celebrate his memory.
There's no telling just what music the world has been deprived of with him not being here.
It would be nice to think what he would have done at 75. The fact that I'm doing any talking about this is even more impressive, since what we did was it's a fly speck of history.
We handled criminals every day. But I do think that night that it was a night in history, and I was a part of it.
John's spirit, in a way, is still alive in people's heart, you know, and the statements he made, the music he made, you know, it's going around the world. So, in a way, it's like he's alive.
Richard Ramirez, a.k.a. the Night Stalker, terrorized Los Angeles for years. In this clip from the Inside Edition vault, he talked about the atrocities he committed.
The horror began in June 1984. Los Angeles was under siege. Death waited in the dark at the hands of a man they called the Night Stalker. After a 14-month reign of terror, he was finally caught. It was only then that his true identity was discovered. His name, Richard Ramirez.
Richard Ramirez's whole trip was to hide in a tree or hide behind a fence and watch his victims at nighttime and wait into the wee hours of the night. And then, while they slept, creep in, you know, like a coward and kill them.
The Night Stalker killed at least 13 times, 13 people who were awakened in the night to face death. At least 15 others survived his brutal attacks.
I didn't particularly care for people.
In a rare interview, Ramirez refused to discuss his own crimes, but had this to say about serial killers.
A serial killer comes about by circumstances and like a recipe, poverty, drugs, child abuse. These things, you know, contribute to a person, to a person's frustration and anger, and at some point in life, he explodes.
Perhaps for Richard Ramirez, that anger and frustration turned to rage, which he in turn took out on his victims. His killings were so sadistic and brutal that even experienced detectives were shocked.
He took a woman in her 60s and stomped her to death with his foot leaving an imprint of a shoe on the side of her face. From that to just executing somebody upon walking into a room after he entered a house. He strangled, he used a ligature, he used a tire iron on a young girl, beat her, left her for dead.
Will your anger subside if you had to wipe up your mother's blood? I couldn't finish it. I had to leave my brother to finish that chore.
Why on earth would you have hurt those people? Why did you kill those people?
No comments. No comments. I cannot answer that at this time.
What was Richard's motive?
To kill.
That's it?
To kill. It's as simple as that.
Richard Ramirez was raised in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children born to hardworking, strict parents. Eddie Milam was Richard's best friend back then and remembers when he began to change into a troublemaker.
I did start seeing something going wrong with Ricky Ramirez. I think what really messed him up was the acid. He would do a lot of acid. The stealing, you know, I noticed the stealing and then started as a peeping Tom and things like that.
Ramirez's passion for burglary earned him the nicknames of Ricky the Thief and Fingers, but Eddie knew Ramirez had other serious problems when he was fired from a local hotel.
He said he was fired, he was dismissed due to the cause that he had tried to molest 2 little kids that were going up the elevator.
By 18, Ramirez was a high school dropout, drifting around California. He stayed in Skid Row hotels, never seemed to work, but always had the money to buy cocaine. Friends say the Richard Ramirez they knew didn't date and wasn't the type to commit such heinous crimes. But convicted murderer Martin Kipp, who befriended Ramirez in prison, says he heard another side of the Night Stalker.
Richard told me he needed to associate gruesome violence with sex in order to be completely satisfied. He also told me that he had to violently fantasize about his victims before he could go away sexually gratified.
They are desires, whereas if I didn't give in to them, I would be crushed by them. I believe in the evil in human nature. This is a wicked world, and in a wicked world, wicked people are born. I'm not going to blame society, my race, or people, or anything. It is up to the individual like myself to keep on knocking on whatever door they want to get into.
Because the victims and the methods of killing were so diverse, many experts felt there was no one Night Stalker. Detectives Carrillo and Salerno disagreed and finally broke the case by matching shoe prints. The subsequent trial turned into one of America's most notorious courtroom dramas, punctuated by continual outbursts from Ramirez. In that trial, Ramirez's fascination with Satanism emerged.
As far as Satan is concerned, I believe in a malevolent being. His description eludes me, but I have felt powers that are evil.
After an 8-month trial, Ramirez was convicted of all 13 murders and given multiple death sentences.
I don't care about myself, really. You know, I don't care about what happens to me. I never did, really.
More Inside Edition True Crime after this.
Chaos at a little boy's birthday party. A freak wind sent a bouncy house flying across the family's backyard in Wills Point, Texas. Everybody chased it to try to stop the giant inflatable. Fortunately, no one was injured.
There's a knock at the door. Who could it be? That's one dirty little angel. Someone's gonna need a bath.
Dirty.
Welcome back. He was known as the Preppy Killer. The story of Robert Chambers made headlines in the 1980s. And in this New York gritty story, Sal Bono examines the case that captivated America.
In 1986, New York City logged more than 1,500 murders, but the media was fixed on the killing of one woman. 18-year-old Jennifer Levin's partially nude body was found in Central Park. The prime suspect was 20-year-old Robert Chambers. His physical appearance and private school upbringing garnered him the nickname the Preppy Killer. But it wasn't just the suspect's good looks that made this case so sensational. Claims of rough sex and a shocking video had the public on the edge of their seats.
For InsideEdition.com, I'm Sal Bono, and this is New York Gritty.
I had no idea how big the case was. When the case ended, a law school classmate of mine called me from California, said, "I've been watching you on TV." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, the Chambers case." I said, "In California?" My name is Roger Stavis, and back in 1986, the Robert Chambers case came into the firm about a week after I started.
In fact, the case would be this former prosecutor's first foray into criminal defense, and a complete departure from any assignment he had before.
There was a new drug called crack.
It is a crack epidemic, which police say is causing an increase in murder and other violent crime.
Crime was rampant. I think New York City last year had less than 300 homicides. In the Bronx, where I was an assistant district attorney, we used to have more than 300 homicides a year just in the Bronx. I had heard something on the radio that morning about this case in Central Park. And as soon as I got into the office, I found out that my office was going to be handling this case.
The NYPD was quick to name a suspect. That's because they noticed a young man lurking around the crime scene with scratches on his face.
This was a kid who fought for her life and lost.
NYPD detective Michael Sheehan conducted an interrogation of Robert Chambers. Chambers had met Jennifer Levin earlier that summer. They crossed paths again that fateful August night in a popular bar on Manhattan's Upper East Side.
It was a chance meeting. He was in Dorian's Red Hand, which was a meeting place for kids that age at the time. That whole crowd. Her biggest mistake was that she trusted Rob Chambers. She came to this park.
Chambers told investigators they left the bar that night and went to Central Park. That's where he says Levin became aggressive with him.
She's raping you in the park? She's having her way with me, without my consent, with my hands behind my back, hurting me.
After hours of questioning, Chambers finally broke down and claimed responsibility for her death, but said it was an accident.
To watch his face and his entire ensemble crumble is a feeling that every homicide detective feels, that you know you have the guy on the ropes. He punched himself in the leg and welled up with tears and the sniffles and said, "What's my mother gonna say?"
Chambers was charged with second-degree murder. Once the public laid eyes on Chambers and the Preppy Killer moniker stuck, the media became obsessed with the case. That complicated Stavis's job as defense attorney.
The first prospective juror was a young woman, and the Judge Howard Bell, asked the young woman if she has any impressions sitting here at the table about Robert Chambers, and she said, "He's much better looking in person." She was excused. He was on the cover of People magazine, which I was not in favor of, but it wasn't my idea, and wearing a blue blazer and looking rather dashing.
Chambers pled not guilty to murder, and the trial got underway. His attorneys played up his claim that Levin died while the two of them were engaged in rough sex, a strategy that did not go over well in the court of public opinion.
What he says happened, this rough sex thing, is ridiculous. It's offensive. It insults the intelligence of any normal person.
If you look at the reporting, was that we were using the blame the victim defense. It wasn't a blame the victim defense, it was a explain what happened defense. I'm a defense attorney. All I care about is defending my client within the bounds of law and ethics. And within the bounds of law and ethics, I would do it again in a case if I had to do it.
The news magazine show A Current Affair also got hold of video taken of Chambers while he was out on bail. Despite a murder charge hanging over his head, he appeared to be living it up and making what seemed like a tasteless joke with a doll.
My name is... Stop!
I think I killed him.
It had nothing to do with her death. It was him acting silly with a bunch of girls, and I thought that they tried to make it as though it had something to do with her death.
But shortly after the video surfaced, facing a deadlocked jury, Chambers decided to change his plea and accept a sentence of 5 to 15 years in prison for manslaughter.
For 2 years, I have not been able to say I'm sorry. I've not been able to say anything. But now I wish to have my feelings known.
Just like that, the preppy killer was off to prison, and the media circus was over.
A case like that is not just a case. It's it takes over your life. You work 7 days a week. You work every night. And then, interestingly, someday, with all of these cases, and I've had several over the years, they stop.
But moving on wasn't as easy for others.
This is not something that ever goes away. People say time heals. That's baloney. Time doesn't heal anything.
10 years after Jennifer Levin's death, her mother spoke with Inside Edition about losing her daughter.
He said he threw her off him because she was hurting him, that she was raping him. And you know, all of this other stuff that makes absolutely no sense to anyone. We made a bargain to get Robert Chambers off the street and into jail. And that's not what we had hoped for, but I really feel we had no choice.
Robert, what's it like to be out? Robert Chambers spent the full 15 years behind bars for Levin's death and was released in 2003. 5 years later, he was back in trouble with the law. Arrested for selling drugs out of his apartment, he was sentenced to another 19 years in prison.
It's just pathetic. After all that, you know, you just wasted your life.
Roger Stavis is still a criminal defense attorney in New York City. He hasn't spoken to Robert Chambers in years, but says this case not only defined his career, but the era in New York.
It's just part of the zeitgeist, if you will, of the 1980s. I think that that's part of the interest. What were the 80s like? You know, Giants win the Super Bowl, the Mets, Koch, Donald Trump.
I can imagine the questions I'm going to get today.
Whatever happened to him? But if you put it all together, those are quintessential New York in the mid-1980s.
A lot of people remember the case and remember that this also could happen to your daughter. This also could happen to your son.
This Amazon driver is about to get a refreshing surprise as he makes his rounds in the blazing California sun. The homeowner has left a note inviting him to take a dip in the pool. If you want to go for a swim, you are welcome to. And he does. He puts his phone and keys on a table and dives in, fully clothed. He didn't even take off his hat or Amazon vest.
When Frank Sinatra Jr. was 19, the son of Old Blue Eyes lived through a nightmarish ordeal. He was kidnapped at a casino in Lake Tahoe. The mastermind of the kidnapping was a troubled young man named Barry Keenan. Keenan spoke to Inside Edition about the crime.
Frank Sinatra fans are mourning the death of his son today.
I want to be a part of it. New York, New York.
Frank Sinatra Jr. carried the mantle of his iconic father all through his life. Last night, while on tour in Daytona, Florida, he suffered a fatal heart attack in his hotel room. Frank Sinatra Sr. was born here on Monroe Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. The building burned down in the 60s. All that remains now is this brick archway. There's a star in the sidewalk that commemorates Hoboken's most famous son. Frank Jr. was born about 4 miles away in Jersey City. When his father hit it big, the family moved to Los Angeles, and that's where Frank Jr. grew up, always in the shadow of his dad. Frank Jr. inherited his father's looks and velvet voice. When Jr. was just 19, he was kidnapped at a casino in Lake Tahoe.
The horrifying ordeal of Frank Sinatra Jr. began while he was filling an engagement at Lake Tahoe.
The mastermind was a troubled young man named Barry Keenan.
He knew I was dangerous. He knew I was just one crack away from killing everybody or not killing me. He didn't know, but he could tell I was crazy.
Inside Edition spoke to Barry Keenan in 2004. Keenan and two cronies were paid a ransom of $240,000, the equivalent of $1.8 million today. The thugs released Jr. on an LA freeway overpass. Then he walked home to the family's mansion in Bel Air.
I was scared, I was a little bit nervous naturally, but the only thing I could do is hope for the best.
Keenan was caught and spent 5 years in prison. Frank Sr. died in 1998 at age 82, and Jr. kept his memory alive, performing his classic songs all over the world. He appeared as himself in an episode of The Sopranos.
Matt, thanks a lot. Here's one for your pal. Cash me out, will you, sunshine?
Thank you, Mr. Sinatra Jr., sir.
Last year, he sang the national anthem at a Yankees game.
Oh, say, can you see?
His sister Nancy is famous for her classic, These Boots Were Made for Walking.
One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you.
She broke the news of her brother's death on Facebook. The Sinatra family mourns the untimely passing of their son, brother, father, uncle, Frank Sinatra Jr. Sleep warm, Frankie.
Powerful stories that change the way you think. Impactful investigations that change the way you see.
How many times has your car been stolen?
5 times.
Yeah.
What? Do you think that you're a responsible owner of tigers?
I damn sure do. Heartwarming moments that change the way you feel.
I feel amazing.
Now available in a place that changes the way you watch TV. Inside Edition, streaming.